this was not about politics and that people campaigning for district attorneys were not campaigning on going after the former president, now current president. But that, of course, is belied by the evidence, and I think we have a video to show just that.
All right, let's get into this, because Dan Goldman had no idea what he walked into, and the moment Russell Fry hit play on those clips, the entire "there's no evidence of weaponization" narrative completely collapsed. But before we dive in, do me a quick favor. If you appreciate debates that actually deal in receipts, not vibes, go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment as we go. This channel is brand new, and we're laser focused on debates like this one, where facts matter more than party loyalty. Alright, let's jump in. Here's how this all starts. Dan Goldman sits there, cool as a cucumber, and confidently declares that there is zero evidence, none, of politicization or weaponization of government against Donald Trump. According to Goldman, the only reason anyone thinks the justice system was weaponized is because Trump said so.
To simply defend Donald Trump and perpetuate the absolute whitewashing that the Republicans have doubled, tripled, quadrupled down on in fealty to Donald Trump, that somehow these were political prosecutions and investigations. And the only evidence of that is that the defendant said it. That's all you have. You have no actual evidence of any politicization or weaponization. There is not an objective judge, prosecutor, or anyone else who understands criminal law who would say there's not enough evidence to charge or to go forward with a search warrant. And all you are doing is trying to create a monarchy for Donald Trump. And that's what you have been doing by yielding all of your power to him for the last 6 weeks.
But here's where things get interesting, because this hearing didn't happen in a vacuum. It wasn't theoretical, and it definitely wasn't happening before all the receipts came out. This was 8 months ago, and since then we've seen wave after wave of evidence showing that the federal and state legal systems weren't just used against Trump, but against conservative lawmakers, activists, parents at school board meetings, and right-leaning organizations across the country. So when Goldman says you have no evidence, what he really means is, please ignore everything you've seen with your own eyes. And Russell Fry was not about to let that slide. This hearing centered around a bill Fry introduced that would shift civil and criminal prosecutions of high-ranking federal officials out of state courts and into the federal system. Why? Because state prosecutors, especially in deep blue jurisdictions, have figured out that going after Trump or Trump-adjacent figures is basically a cheat code for winning elections. And Fry didn't just say that, he proved it. This is where Goldman's argument completely fell apart, because Fry didn't respond with opinion. He responded with video, actual footage.
This was not about politics, and that people campaigning for district attorneys were not campaigning on going after the former president, now current president. But that, of course, is belied by the evidence, and I think we have a video to show just that.
Whoever has this job, are they going to convict Donald Trump?
Look, that is the number one issue. I'm the candidate in the race who has the experience with Donald Trump. We sued the Trump administration over 100 times. I sued Trump over 100 times and brought a case against the Trump Foundation and held him accountable, holding Trump accountable for the Trump Foundation.
From exposing illegal behavior by the Trump Foundation.
I do have a lot of experience with the former president. I led the New York State Attorney General's work and investigation and successful litigation against him and his family for their misconduct with the Trump Foundation. And also we had a number of litigations, more than 100 involving the Trump administration. I led the team that held Trump and his children accountable for their misconduct with the Trump Foundation. I oversaw the work which
Democrats, in their own words, campaigning on the promise of getting Trump. And once those clips started rolling, the entire room changed. Let's talk about what we heard. You had candidates flat out saying that the number one issue in their race was convicting Donald Trump. Not crime in Manhattan, not public safety, not quality of life issues. Trump. You had officials bragging about suing Trump over 100 times. Not quietly, not reluctantly, proudly. Like it was a campaign badge of honor. Letitia James didn't hide it. She openly talked about leading investigations into Trump and his family. Alvin Bragg didn't hide it either. He talked about his experience holding Trump accountable, as if that alone qualified him for office. And this is the key point, because Goldman claimed no one campaigned on prosecuting Trump. That claim did not survive even 5 minutes of video evidence. And here's the thing, if you're running for district attorney and you campaign on prosecuting one specific individual, especially a former president, that should immediately raise red flags. The job of a prosecutor is to enforce the law impartially, not to pick a political villain and reverse engineer charges around them. But that's exactly what happened. Take Alvin Bragg's case. Legal experts across the spectrum pointed out that if the defendant's last name wasn't Trump, the charges likely would have been misdemeanors at best, and even that's generous. So why escalate them to felonies? Well, here's where the political math comes in. The statute of limitations for misdemeanor business record falsification is 2 years. For the felony version, it's 5. So by bumping the charges up, suddenly the case becomes viable. Not because justice demanded it, but because timing did. That's not law enforcement, that's lawfare. And it didn't stop there. Bragg even layered in identity politics to justify the prosecution.
When I was at the Attorney General's office, I led our work on the Trump Foundation matter.
I also led the team that did the Trump Foundation case, and I've seen him up front and seen the lawlessness that he can do.
Started out as a civil rights lawyer, then became a federal prosecutor, ultimately was the #2 lawyer in the New York State Attorney General's office, leading the charge against the racist policies of the Trump administration.
I believe we have to hold him accountable. I've litigated with him, and so I'm prepared to go where the facts take me once I see them and hold him accountable. Being a rich old white man has allowed you to evade accountability in Manhattan. That includes Trump and his children, right? We held him accountable in the Trump Foundation case. My office did the Trump University case. So I've seen a pattern of lawlessness over 20 years, and so I'm inclined to believe all I see in the public domain and know that and believe that there's a path forward there to make a case.
Since when does skin color determine guilt? Since when does identity replace evidence? This is the kind of rhetoric that poisons public trust in the judicial system, and that trust is already hanging by a thread. Here's the bigger picture. Over the last 2 decades, both parties have chipped away at institutional norms. Nationwide injunctions became a weapon, friendly judges became political tools, and now we've reached the point where courtrooms are just another battlefield in the culture war. Instead of focusing on crime, inflation, border security, or public safety, politicians are laser focused on prosecuting their opponents. Because it's easier, it gets headlines, it fires up the base, and it guarantees donations. Russell Fry nailed this point when he said prosecutors in places like Manhattan aren't worried about crime in Manhattan.
So I think we go back to the basic premise of the bill, is that you have a prosecutor in New York. He's not worried about crime in New York, Manhattan. He is worried about going after the former president of the United States. Why? Because it earns him political points in a jurisdiction that did not vote for Donald Trump. And so they elected this guy to go after him, despite the fact that there are other crimes that you could be going after, but resources are dedicated. And so to sit here today and say that this has not been about politics, this is about fairness in the system, it's total BS to believe that that is actually the case, because he said it 1,000,000 times on television. He campaigned on it, and that is the purpose. One of the huge purposes of this bill is to remove that from a fairness perspective, that a jury in a federal system, that a different system that is not rigged in a state court can go and have a fair trial. The presumption of innocence is on a criminal defendant, and if we do this for ambassadors, if we do this for sitting presidents right now, why would we not extend that to somebody when they are targeting a former president or vice president?
The real question isn't whether powerful people should be held accountable. Of course they should. The real question is, how do you prevent accountability from becoming a political weapon? Because once the legal system is seen as just another arm of partisan warfare, everyone loses. Conservatives stop trusting the courts. Liberals stop trusting the courts when power shifts. And regular Americans are left wondering whether justice even exists anymore. And here's the irony. The same people screaming about defending democracy are perfectly fine fine with prosecutors campaigning on locking up their political enemies. That's not democracy. That's something much closer to what they claim to fear. Dan Goldman walked into that hearing convinced he had the moral high ground, convinced there was no evidence, convinced Republicans were just making excuses for Trump, and then Russell Fry pressed play. And once the clips rolled, there was no coming back from it. Because when politicians tell you who they are, on camera, on the campaign trail, in their own words, you should believe them. And now I want to know what you think. Is shifting these cases to federal court a necessary safeguard, or does it go too far? How do we stop courts from being turned into political weapons without letting powerful people off the hook? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I actually read them. And if you want more debates like this, more breakdowns where receipts matter, and less cable news spin, make sure you're subscribed. We're just getting started.